Power BI Embedding November update. Before you get into that, tell us a little bit about who Ted Pattison is.
I'm a Gemini. I was born in Connecticut, but have lived in many different states. I've been a technical nerd for all my professional life. I've been teaching for about 25 years. Power BI and the Power Platform is actually my third wave. So the first big wave I wrote was the component object model. We got about a decade worth of training out of that, and then same with SharePoint. And now we're kind of on to, what's new and what's exciting to people who are developing on the Microsoft platform. And, we think that the Power Platform is a pretty compelling story. So how did you buy that?
I did. I bought that quite well. And then you're also involved with the user group down in Tampa, and you do some training stuff?
So my company, Critical Path Training, offers Power BI training and Power Apps and Flow training. And I like to focus on the development side. So when I started liking Power BI, and it's a no-code platform, well, it's no-code, low-code. So low-code kind of says Microsoft is kind of pointing out there are developer extensibility points. And I think Power BI embedding has kind of proven to be the hottest topic as far as developer extensibility points in the Power Platform today.
Yep. Makes perfect sense.
So that's what we're going to talk about. Now, there's been some updates to the platform itself since the last talk, but I kind of wanted to shift the update to the audience. I wanted to update the audience because, what I've seen is Power BI embedding. One of the toughest parts has been authentication and picking on authentication scheme. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on Azure AD applications. I also haven't seen much online about how to create these with PowerShell. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And in the past, I've shown a Daily Reporter Pro application. So I wanted to kind of shift away from that and show some other styles of applications today. Okay, so what we're going to look at here, first of all, I have a GitHub repository. Let me go ahead and switch over, Chuck, and show you this. So if you go to github.com, Critical Path Training, DP, or it's developing with Power BI embedding, so DPBIE. And we go inside here, here's a whole bunch of files that I'm going to share with everyone today. Now, this project I'm working on is kind of somewhere in between a book and a white paper. For instance, I've kind of finished the first couple chapters right here. I look at chapter 1 right here, and it's about 20 pages of just, some fundamental background before you start developing. I have chapter 2, which is kind of a lab, which I'm going to encourage everyone to go through. I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking a little bit more about the developer quick start, but it's just a PDF file that you can download and begin working on a lab that will take you soup to nuts through the whole process of getting up and running. Now, there's a third chapter kind of in the middle of, which is on securing applications with Azure AD. And remember, the focus here is Power BI embedding. So everything kind of is leading up to, being a better developer. And then I guess sometime over the next 3 months, I'm going to create chapter 4, which is going to be the Power BI Service API chapter, and chapter 5, which is going to be the Power BI JavaScript API chapter. So I'm probably about 3 months. Of course, as a writer, you always take what you think and multiply by 3. So just 9 months away from being able to kind of finish this off. Okay, but second thing I wanted to point out is that I'm also putting together a 2-day developer workshop around this material. So here is, if you go to Critical Path Training and you go to the one particular page, for this particular course, Developing with Power BI Embedding, we're doing one up in Portland just in a couple weeks with CSG Pro. We're working with them, and then we're doing another one in Tampa. So if someone really wanted to kind of get up to speed, I think we have a fairly unique offering in the industry, with this type of hands-on training. Okay, now what I'd like to do now is just kind of reiterate what is the big picture. I've done this slide pretty much every time I've talked about Power BI embedding for the last year, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page. The idea is that you have a user, and the user is using your application through a browser, whether that is a single page application, an MVC application with server-side code. What we need to be able to do is go to Azure AD and get an access token, mainly because getting the access token is what allows us to call the Power BI service. So we call the Power BI service because we want to get information about the reports or the dashboards in a particular app workspace. And once we get that data back, we move it to the browser. So the final stage is always going to be client-side code when we're working with Power BI embedding. And if you have an MVC application you've created with ASP.NET or ASP Core, generally you have server-side code that's calling to the service, but then you have some model that passes the embedding data for reports and dashboards to the browser. And we also have to get some type of security token there. And then the final part is always going to be to use the Power BI JavaScript API, which is a JavaScript file that Microsoft has given us. You include it in your project, and then you call methods on that. And what that does is it does the final step, which creates an iframe. So all of Power BI embedding is based on you have an embedding data, you calling a method that creates an iframe, and that iframe gets initialized directly to the Power BI service. So what's kind of neat is that once you set up this connection, the user can directly use the report and click on slicers and basically have all the interactive behavior that you would get, as if the user were looking at the same report, through the Power BI portal. Okay, let me go ahead and look at some of the things that we're going to see over this next hour. If I go into my account in Power BI, we've created a new app workspace called Chuck's Treehouse. I hope you like that inside there. We have a couple different reports right here we want to embed. We have a couple different dashboards. And once again, if I go and I open, something like this report, from the Power BI portal, the user doesn't need my custom application. But what I'd like to start doing is surfacing, these reports and these custom applications in other places. Okay, let's go through a couple more slides here. Now, the first thing to do anytime you start any project that's going to do Power BI embedding is you have to make a choice between first-party embedding and third-party embedding.
We've already had a question, and this is what the question was on, is what's the difference between first party versus third party, or app owns data versus user owns data? So perfect timing.
Okay. Could you do me a favor and send that user $5 somehow? Can you find some online mechanism to
if they tell me where they're at, I'll make sure that their user group gets a shirt for them. How's that?
Some kind of new wave payola.
Yeah, there you go.
First party embedding is when you authenticate the user and then you take that access token that has the current user's identity and you use that to interact with the Power BI service. Now, when we create that iframe, we're going to have to pass a security token back. And so it's just the user's Azure AD access token that we push back to the browser. And that is what gets passed to the Power BI JavaScript API when we embed the report or we embed the dashboard. Now, important thing to note is that when you work with first-party embedding, everybody has to have a Power BI license. Everybody has to have an Azure AD user account. Now, the user accounts, it's getting more flexible where the consumer user accounts don't have to be in the same tenant anymore, as where the report and the Power BI capacity is located. But anytime you're going to do any type of authoring, you need to have a license, inside of that particular tenant. Okay, but the key point here is that a user gets to my application, I authenticate the user as him or her, and then the application runs as that user, and it calls into the Power BI Service API with the identity of that user, and with the permissions of that user, and your application can only access resources that the current user has permissions to access.
So I'm going to repeat that one more time. You said it 3 times. Let's see if we can get it 5. So first party, the application runs as the user.
That's correct.
Why don't you repeat that one more time so we'll make sure Luis has got that as well.
The application runs as the current user and can access only the Power BI resources the current user can access.
And that's first party or user owns data.
User owns data. Perfect. The scenario, which would be most popular for this, would you have a single organization, that has hundreds or thousands of users, and you want to create an application for users within a single organization, or possibly multiple organizations. But the key fact is everybody has to have a Power BI license. If you're serving it from an embedded capacity, from a dedicated capacity, you can basically have users with free licenses, but if you're serving just from the regular shared capacity, all your users are going to have Power BI Pro licenses. Okay,
So
now
Stephen asked that question. So yeah, and you just answered it, but I want to make sure I'm called out. Is that you do not have to have a dedicated or a premium capacity because you're actually using their pro licenses. Is that right, Ted?
yes, if you have pro licenses for all your users, you can do first-party embedding without having any type of dedicated capacity, without Power BI Premium. If that's the question, yeah, that is true.
That's exactly right.
So it's only when we want the free user, to access content is when the free licensed user accessing content is what requires the dedicated capacity. Okay, now I think you like things that are flashing, Chuck. So third-party embedding, known as the app owns data model. So this is the ISV model. So imagine I'm an ISV. I have some customer portal I've had for 10 years. I'm not going to create an application from scratch. And I'm certainly not going to get my 5,000 customers Power BI licenses. So I want to pay Microsoft a lump sum and being able to serve up reports and dashboards to people that Microsoft, Azure AD, and Power BI have no idea who they are. So that's what third-party embedding is. Now, third-party embedding today requires that you create a master user account. The master user account is something we won't have to create pretty soon, and I'll talk about why. But today, what the requirements are is that you create a Azure AD account, in the tenant that has your app workspace. We then make it an administrator of the app workspace. Now, when the master user account authenticates, it has full control over everything, and you have 100 different users coming in. Yet, any one of those user requests, we're going to call into the Power BI Service API with the same master user account. Now, one of the issues with the master user account is that it's all powerful in that app workspace. So the last thing we want to do is take an Azure AD token for an administrator and pass it back, into the browser of 100 different users. So with Power BI, we create something called an embed token. So you have the Azure AD token, and then you use it to get the embedding information for a report. Then you make a second call into the Power BI service to get the embed token. Now, the embed token is much better for security because the embed token is only good for one report, or one particular dashboard. Plus, when you create an embed token, you can make it so it's, read only or read write. So knowing which one you're going to create is going to be important. Now, what are the different types of embeddable resources? We're going to see these in just a second. We're going to see there are reports. You can embed a dashboard. You can embed just a tile from a dashboard, or you could go through a whole dashboard, take the tiles and embed them individually. You can also embed new reports. And then as of just last couple months, we can now embed the Q&A experience. Now, it's also possible to embed a report with a custom layout so that you kind of do a trick where it looks like you're embedding a single visual, but the trick would be embed a report that has 6 visuals, but have a custom layout that hides 5 of those visuals and takes the one that we're going to show and makes it, X equals 0, Y equals 0, and then has the width and height of the container. So it basically just kind of takes up the whole container that you have to serve it up with. Now, one of the things that I've done is I've created this big, long lab that I encourage people to do. So let me go back here. If I go back, into our workshop here, and I open up this, here is this lab. Now, Chuck, you're wondering where it is. Remember that if you go back to that GitHub repository, O2, Chapter 2, Developer Quick Start, that's what this is. So the way that I ran this lab is that if you have nothing other than Visual Studio installed, you can basically go through and do this lab. So the first one's going to have you create a Office 365 trial tenant. Second one has you use something which is called the Power BI onboarding experience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a second, but this kind of shields you from having to know about Azure Active Directory. Of course, after I'm done explaining this, I'm going to talk more about Azure Active Directory so you're less dependent on the Power BI embedding onboarding experience wizard. But then it kind of takes you through the steps of creating a ASP.NET MVC project from scratch and just kind of coding in all the different pieces. So you're going to spend about an hour building an application. Let me show you what the application does, when you're all done. let's go back here. And there's also a solution, so if you just want to open up the solution right here, note that along the way, you're going to be taking, all kinds of GUIDs for application IDs, data sets, reports. And because in this example, we're using third-party embedding, we also have to have the account name of the master user account. I have the password. I put the password way out here to the right so Chuck can't see it and attempt to break in. Okay, but now let's go ahead and run this right here. So once again, if you want to get started with Power BI embedding and you have Visual Studio and you like using ASP.NET MVC, here's a lab that you can go through soup to nuts. And by the time you get to the end, you'll be able to click on a link and you'll be able to embed a report. And also the lab has you do things like put some giant client-side code using the JavaScript API so you can do things like toggle in and out of edit mode. One of the really neat things about reports is that when you embed them, I can basically have this user go down and make a change. And now this user can save that change. And if we now kind of go back and kind of see what happened, let's go back to Chuck's treehouse. Let's go back to this report and open it up right here. So the user has this application open in the portal, and this other user has it open over here, are basically both able to save, into the same live report that's up there running in the Power BI service. Now, if you keep going through the lab, we have you embed a dashboard, just to kind of look at what a dashboard looks like. This is kind of neat, Chuck, because I can come back here. Let's go back to my dashboards. Let's take this guy right here and let's kind of put him up over here and now go back over here and you kind of say, hey, what's going on over there? Oh, so dashboards are live. That's one of the big differences that dashboards have over reports is that there's this live connection. Every time you do it, it's kind of getting the update inside there. Okay, we're also going to show you how to update the how to embed the QA experience. And the idea is that just like you can get the QA experience running, inside of the Power BI portal, you can also embed it in a custom application. Here's a case where I've kind of, seeded it with a question inside here. Do I want to go ahead and, say as, and you can kind of see, as we start using the technique in here, and let's see if this is going to, okay, well, sales revenue, by quarter, and you can kind of see, how it's able to, help me down as I go and do things. The last thing we have you do, if you go through this lab, is to embed a new report. And the idea of embedding a new report is you point to a existing data set. You then basically go through the steps to embed the report on top of that. But now what we have is we have the ability for, I'll do something really simple here. We'll just take sales revenue by, how about the sales region. And because I can really piss off Chuck by using a pie chart, we'll use a pie chart here. Now that we've got this pie chart, let's go back and do a save as. So one of the things about Power BI embedding is a little bit tricky is how you have to handle save as. So let's say I'll just call this one report 1, 2, 3. We go ahead, choose OK. And so back here, what we should be able to see, as I went through there, I just basically created this new report from scratch. Let's go back here. And if I now kind of dig into some of this code right here. So for instance, if we go down to the views, and now we go to home, and now I go to new report. One of the things that you can see here is that, as someone clicks save, a client-side event handler fires. And so one of the things that you can see here is I can basically just redirect and kind of get back to the embedded report over here. Okay, so it's a little bit extra code to do that save as redirect, but we kind of have you do that in the lab, just to show you how to create apps that allow users to be content authors, not just consumers, which I think is a pretty big, important part of the Power BI embedding platform, especially when you compare it to, some of the competitors in the industry that are trying to get into the game. that have the consumer side, but don't have the authoring side to any degree. Okay, so now you've seen that.
So Ted, Stephen had a question about what you were just showing a second ago. If you actually wanted to display two reports or two different visuals in the same web page and the security is the same, would you use the same embed token or would you go ahead and create two different ones?
You have to create two embed tokens because, well, I mean, I guess theoretically you could embed the same report twice, but if you're embedding two different reports, they have to be separate embed tokens because any embed token is only good for one embeddable resource. So I think that's the main thing to know for that scenario. Okay, now what I want to do now, Chuck, is go a little bit into Azure AD. So let's go ahead and I'm now going to go over and kind of move into the Azure portal. And as Chuck, you well know, in Azure AD, we have two ways to authenticate. We've had the way we've authenticated for several years now. It's been in production, which is known as the Azure AD V1 endpoint. Let's go here. And what Microsoft has been doing for the last year is coming up with a new paradigm, a new UI for registering applications, and a different endpoint to allow for some new behaviors. Now, up to recently, you had to create different types of objects. Now, the Azure AD team has us just create a single object, and it works for both endpoints. Also note that recently, app registrations preview has appeared inside here. So if I create a new registration inside here,
I have not seen this. This is very cool.
Nice. This is pretty new. Yeah, I guess this is probably, 3 or 4 days ago. I mean, what have you been doing?
I don't know. I've been slacking apparently. And for people who go through this, it seems like most of our failures end up in here. They just have forgotten their secret. They get the client ID wrong. They use server side instead of native. But most of our failures seem to be in what should have been the easiest spot. So this is cool.
Okay, now let's do this. I'm going to put in the URL. If you were going to go through the lab, we have you work through using the Power BI onboarding tool. So if I say embed for my customers, that pretty much means use third-party embedding. If I say embed for my organization, not your organization, it would be first party. So in the lab, we have you kind of go through and click on embed first party. Go ahead and sign in, make sure you're signed in as the right user, register your application. So let's go ahead and move next. And we'll call this one something like, Bob's, your uncle. As you do that, now you have these different permissions that you need to select. So let's say I select, a handful of these permissions inside here. We'll go ahead and choose register. Now they can also create a workspace for you. So let's go down here and we'll call this something like Ted's Treehouse. Once we've done that, choose create app workspace. They just kind of keep giving you the GUIDs that you're going to need inside here. Now, if you want, you can import content. So let's say that I had, some type of a PBIX file, and inside the PBIX file, I could upload those. I'm not going to do that, but I can also now grant permissions. Let's go ahead and click on that. And now I get through this scene. And, what I want to show is that, after we've done that, let's go back here and let's go ahead and refresh my screen for a second. And now let's go ahead and look at all apps inside here. And what we should see here, is Bob's your uncle. So what this tool did for us, was to create this new application. If I look in here at the application and I go to settings, the important part for a native application is that we have Power BI service permissions. Now, what people will find is that you can also go and create one of these yourself. Now, I'm going to recommend you learn PowerShell, but let's go ahead and take a one more kind of trip through here. So we'll create another one. This one is going to be Chuck's Your Ant. We'll have this one be native, HTTP, S, and localhost /app123. Note that, once I tab out of this and create this, I've got a new Azure AD application. We've got the GUID that we need. Remember, Chuck, that there is this ambiguity where half the world calls this an application ID and the other half call it a client ID. And as you go back and forth between libraries, they just switch back and forth. So just schizophrenically, keep in your head that application ID means client ID. They're the same thing. We should have just had one name.
I asked our team to go ahead and standardize on one of them, and they said the Azure team actually uses it both intermittently. So
yes, it's a mess.
I am hoping that somebody will just go out and say this is the right one and just agree on one. It doesn't really matter which one to me.
Peace in the Middle East and Trump having a great hairstyle would probably both be achieved before we consolidate to a single ID or a client ID. Okay. Cool. I've made Chuck laugh now. Let's keep going through here. But then, another thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to set permissions inside here. I can come through and I can click on permissions, add permissions with the Power BI Service API, and then I can kind of choose the permissions. Now, an interesting point here, Chuck, is that once you've created permissions, and they are delegated permissions, meaning that they're user specific, the first time a user logs on, a user is going to have to authenticate. And there are many scenarios where the user, is not an interactive login, but we're just logging in by passing a username and password. So this grant permissions button gets to be very important because we need to kind of click that ahead of time and grant permissions, to all users so that your application can make a authenticated connection in the case where you kind of have a unattended execution scenario. Okay, now you've seen that. What I want to do is I want to go back and I want to look in the folder, and remember that this folder I'm looking in right now is the same folder of that repository. So let's say I want to create a application. So I've got some PowerShell scripts that are going to show that. Let's say I want to register a native application, and let's kind of show how we can get started here. Now, what I'm going to do here is, log in to Azure AD. So Azure AD has this library, and it has new Azure AD application. This has really changed over the last year, because we didn't have Azure AD. We had our Azure RM, and it's a different library. It had some of the methods, but I think you'll find that this one is going to be much easier. So in our case right here, let's say we change this name, my first native app, take 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new Azure AD application. In fact, why don't I go ahead and just run this right here? And as I run this script, I should then, be able to go back inside here and, look at the registrations that we have. And if I now go down here and take a look, what we've just created. And where did I create this? Oh, I created it, in the wrong place. Let me go ahead and do a quick switch. So Power BI embedding. Let's go ahead and hit save and run this one more time. And what did I do? Yes, one more change here. Sorry, Chuck, I'm letting you down. Okay, save, and we'll run this one more time. Okay, so as we call new Azure AD application, let's go back here and do this one more time. And so now what we should see here is somewhere inside here. Now we have the, my app take 2. Okay, now some of the other things that you might want to do is we can basically, figure out who the owner is. And it's not going to automatically assign the owner. Now let's move ahead and let's look at something a little bit more extravagant here. So what I want to do is I want to run the one where I'm going to register an application that's not a native, but it's a web app. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and when we call this right here, we have to get a bunch of different things. let me go ahead and run this right here. And now that we have run this, it's also going to bring up a little text file for me because this is some information I'm going to have to put into my application. Let's go ahead and move back here, and let's go ahead and do a refresh. So what we just created here is the Daily Reporter Personal. This one's got a 98 inside here. So as I do this, and I look at things like the reply URL, when I have a web app, and we're going to use the OpenID Connect protocol to get an access token, you have to have a reply URL, and you can see that this is where my application is going to be running. Okay. Secondly, let's go ahead and look at settings. And as I look at settings here and required permissions, what you're going to see is that this already has the permissions set. Now, this is a little bit of a mess, how you deal with permissions. So once again, I create the new Azure AD application, and then you set the Azure AD application. And then there's also another important aspect. There is something which is called the Azure Service Principal. Now, you have an application, and your application has to be installed in one Azure tenant. So what I want to do is give a quick explanation of why we need a service principal in addition to the application itself. So the service principal represents the application's identity within a single tenant. So you can install an Azure AD application and configure it to be multi-tenant. And that means you're going to have users in multiple tenants who all access the same thing. So we need a service principal for each tenant. And that's kind of what serves as the identity and tracks the permissions, of what users have granted permissions to use that inside here. Now, here's where things get a little bit tricky here, because one of the things that we need to do is we need to set permissions. We don't want to have to click, 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 do it by hand. I want to do it in a script. So what you see here is that at the very end here, there's a lot of permissions I'm adding. There is a set Azure AD application. So you have to use the object ID, but then we give it sets of permissions. So the problem with sets of permissions is that you have to figure out what API and what permissions you want. So in our case right here, well, the first thing that I want is I want a Microsoft Graph API permission, which is basically the permission to sign in. And you get that by using the GUID. Now I have a display Power BI permissions inside here. So the Power BI Service API has a well-known GUID, which is this right here. So if then you want to get the Azure AD Service Principal for the Power BI Service API in your tenant, we do that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to say, show me all the OAuth 2 permissions that we have inside there. Let's go ahead and run this right here. And student at and let's go ahead. And once I am able to log in here, the script should run. So what this script has done for me is just to kind of go through, enumerate through all the different user or delegated permissions. So that's what you need. You need the GUID. Even though it would have been better if we could have used this inside there. You can also see that of the delegated permissions, some require admin permissions, many don't. So what we're doing here, is basically just kind of configuring these different permissions. Okay, now let's say that we've now been to a point where we've created the permissions. The last important thing that we need to create for this web application is a key, what we can call an app password. Now, if you were going to do this by hand, one of the things that you could do is you could come in here and you could say, key 2, you could give it a duration, and then you could go ahead and click save. And then you kind of got this one-time opportunity to kind of take this and copy and paste it into your code. But we can automate setting a key value, inside of our PowerShell script. as we go through here, we're going to create an app secret. So here I'm just using a trick where I create a new GUID and then I convert it to a base 64 string. And if you have a base 64 string and you end with an equal sign, it's kind of a pad to put on the end of it. But then once I've created the app secret, well, there is a .NET object I can create, a password credential. I can put the start date, end date, the key value, and all of a sudden I've done it programmatically. So here we're going to register the Azure AD application, but you can also see that, when I'm done, I'm going to bring up this right here that basically gives me the important information. So let's do this. Let's now go over and I'm going to load in another application. Now, the next application we're going to look at is going to use first-party embedding, and it's called Daily Reporter Personal. Let's go ahead and open that up. Note that when you open this, it will require a couple different things, like the client ID. In fact, let's go ahead and use the client ID of the app that we just created. And one of the neat things that you're going to see here, this is a brand new, fresh app, is that the user has never granted the application permissions to use things inside there. Okay, so now that we have these values inside, okay, we also have to set this application to a workspace ID. So most of the projects that I work on, we basically point to a single app workspace or possibly a small number of app workspaces where we're going to pull our content. Okay, let's go ahead and start up this application right here. So now that we start up this application, what I want to see here is that we have sign in. Now, remember, this is first party. And what Microsoft has been proposing for a while now, if you're going to use Azure AD and the OpenID Connect, is that there is a series of different OWIN-based libraries that we can use. And so if I look here and look in startup, what we need is we need to get these values, the client ID, the client secret, the reply URL. But now we use OWIN components to initialize our application, and we're going to use cookies. So when you use the OWIN middleware for cookies, when you authenticate the user, it creates a cookie and moves it back and forth that contains that user identity information. And it also has server-side encryption signing and tampering checking. So in general, the cookies, once you authenticate the user, keep the user authenticated. And then second, we're going to say use OpenID Connect. And the idea here, let's go ahead and click on sign in, is that when the user clicks sign in, now, one thing that happened here is that since I've already authenticated, it's kind of taking my user. So what I think I'm going to do is let's take the same thing here just to see if I can kind of get the whole experience. And I'm going to go up into a new incognito window and let's try the same thing. Okay, so now this time we click sign in. And the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to say the user needs to sign in. Fine. Okay, so now this user signs in, clicks on next, enters the password. Now, if this is my second or third time through, I'd be done. But it's my first time through, so it sees that I've never basically granted permissions to this application. So in an application where you have this interactive flow, it makes a lot of sense, to do something like that. Now, once again, I wanted to kind of show, different styles in this application. Let me go back to this first screen right here. So what I'm doing in this application is when the user is authenticated, we're going to push something very different back. So let's go down here and let's look at home. And what you're going to see here is that if the user has been authenticated, we're going to do something, very different. So here, if the user is authenticated, we're going to basically build this big piece of JSON, and we're going to push it back and call it view model. So if I come back here, And let's do a Control-Shift-I. And now we have the window dot. And now if we say view model, so here is just a piece of JavaScript that I'm creating on the server and pushing back a single time over to the client. Now, if I take a look at some of this code that does that, inside of models, we have something which is the Power BI Embedded Service Manager, and it has this get view model JSON. So it's going to create a connection with a Power BI client. It's then going to create a view model by getting the data sets. And notice that the data set objects, the data sets object, when it comes back, has a bunch of properties, including a value property that actually has the array. So we're putting that inside there. If I just, for 1 second, move over and look at the MVC view models inside here, basically we have this home view model we're passing back. Okay. And then inside here, what you can see here is that I create a new view model. I include the access token inside there. It's first-party embedding, so we don't need to keep getting embed tokens, so we can pass back a single access token. But the idea is that, once we get that data back here, now I can basically just, have entirely client-side code, that goes through the process, of embedding a dashboard or a report inside there. Okay, so what I wanted people to do is just kind of see another approach. Most of the examples I've put out to date, have been third-party. So here's just a good example of first-party embedding, including, the code that uses Azure AD and the Active Directory Authentication Library for .NET, to kind of give you a sign-in flow, and hopefully, in addition, giving you the PowerShell scripts will help you out. Now, we've got about 15 more minutes, so I want to look at 2 other applications that I have. Now, Daily Reporter Personal, is a typical first-party application. And you can see when it starts up, it basically challenges the user to enter username and password, and it goes through the typical OpenID Connect authentication flow to basically get an access token. Sometimes you don't have the luxury, of using this authentication flow we just looked at because you don't have the ability to hold secrets. Okay, what do I mean by that? Let me go back to the slides just for a second. So one of the things I wanted to do is, show that as you go through, the Embedding Wizard, I'll just kind of quickly move through these slides here. It creates the Azure AD application on your behalf. And it can also create an app workspace and import content, if that's what you want. But at the very end, note that the Onboarding Wizard does something very important. Because it's creating a third-party embedding app that's based on a user authenticating, when you use third-party embedding, generally you just authenticate with the user credentials. Here's a username and password. Let's just make one call and get back the access token. Well, the problem is that that doesn't allow for any type of interaction. So if the user hasn't already granted permissions to the application, that call will fail. So when people are using third-party embedding, generally they've had to go up to Azure AD, go to the application and click that grant permissions button. And you can kind of see one of the nice things that the embedding setup wizard does is it kind of takes care of that granting of permissions for you. Excuse me. Okay, now what I want to do is just talk a little bit more about OpenID Connect, because that's what we're using to connect. And there are basically 4 possible flows. So if you have been using third-party embedding, the only flow that is currently supported, let me get back here, is the user credentials flow. So once again, if you're using third-party embedding today, user credentials flow is the only game in town, and it's less than ideal for a few different reasons. One is that you have to do it as a native client. You cannot register as a web API because you have to use the user credential flow and pass a username and password. And so that's something that, many people, including the Azure AD team, say don't use it unless you have to. But in third-party embedding today, we have to. Now, there's good news. It's not yet time for the good news to be here. It will be here soon. But Microsoft has announced support for using app-only tokens. So let's kind of look at down here, what's on the bottom. The idea of client credentials flow is that your application can authenticate itself, without any need for a user to be involved. And once we get to that point, we're going to have a much more secure flow, and you won't have to create this master user account as we do today. Let me get back here and back to the browser TED. Okay, and now let's go to Azure AD one more time. So what I want you to see here is that let's go to Azure AD and go to one of our applications. So if I go to applications, and now we go to that daily reporter personal, and I go to settings, and now we go to required permissions. Okay, and let's go to the Power BI service permissions. Note that today, the only permissions that work are delegated permissions. Now, today, there's nothing that's going to stop you, if you know Azure AD, from basically getting an app-only access token for the Power BI service. The problem is that none of the methods respect it. So what they're now doing is kind of working the code path so that if you do an app-only authentication and you have a permission, such as read and write all tenant or all content in tenant, then as you call methods, they will succeed. So that's the work they're currently doing. Once again, today you can get an app-only token for Power BI. You just can't do anything with it. It doesn't work. But that will be straightened out soon. And so for third-party embedding, it will be nice. And I suspect this will be sometime next year, hopefully first quarter, maybe second quarter, that everything rolls out of preview, So now you've seen that. The last thing I want to talk about today is that if you have the authorization code grant flow, that's the one we just looked at. It has to be a confidential client, meaning that it can hold on to a secret. So one more time, what is a secret? Well, if you have a key and your application, inside of your web.configuration file has that key value, and if the bad guy gets that key, it's bad news. A confidential client is a client that could hold on to secrets without putting them at risk. Now, let's say we move from this application and we're going to have an application that's entirely client-side, a single-page application. Now, once again, I'm going to show two more. Both of these are in the demos directory. Let's look at this one called Power BI Day Spa. Now, the first thing to note about SPAs is that they have to be public clients because they can't keep secrets. And so they're going to use something which is called the implicit flow. Now, with the implicit flow, let's go back and let's look at this Power BI Day Spa. And I'm going to have to click on manifest because in the V1 UI, they don't give you any other way to look at this property than looking at the manifest. But what you see here is there's something which is called allow implicit flow. And the idea of the implicit flow is it allows a client-side application that has no server-side code and can't keep any secrets. It lowers the security barrier so this application can call in and get back an access token. Now, when we want to do that, and there's two we're going to show here, there is a library that Microsoft has, which is called adl.js. So it's the Active Directory Authentication Library, the JavaScript version. Now, one thing that's a little bit strange is that this library is packaged and shipped with another one, which is called adl-angular.js. And what's unfortunate is that sometimes you want to use adl and adl angular together, and sometimes you just want to use adl by itself, but you can't download the package by itself. It only comes, with both things. Okay, now in our application here, if you, want to go and get this thing up and running, you'll see that there is a TypeScript class, which is called the SPA auth service. So here we have things that we need, such as what's the string that identifies the Power BI service? When I want to get an access token back for the Power BI service, what's the ID I pass to tell it Power BI service? That's that value right there. Now here is some kind of low-level code. I don't think I'm going to step through all this right here, but just kind of show you what the thing looks like. Also, as we do that, let's go ahead and bring up our friend. And our friend over here is Fiddler. So we'll go ahead and log on. And what you can see is that this library kind of helps me by putting me to the important Microsoft endpoints. And I've already been through the authentication scenario here. If I log out, log back in again, you can kind of see that if you use these libraries, it just takes you to the regular pages that Microsoft users are used to going to. And when I go ahead and we choose OK here, what we can see is that coming back here, and we kind of look at the requests, as they are coming back inside here. And what you could see as, at the end of the day, we're able to get an access token down here. Note that right here, it says access token. So basically it's just kind of passed back as a URL fragment. And then your application, once it gets the access token, can do the same type of things, where we're going to call into the Power BI service API here. Let's go ahead and get the reports. And you can see that here, my application is just kind of calling into the Power BI service API, getting information about the different reports that are inside here. And then it's basically, using those reports, to be able to do the embedding. Okay, true. I have not spent a long time going into these applications, but I have 5 more minutes and I want to show you one other application. So this application is going to be like the one we just saw in the fact that it is a single page application. But now we're going to move outside of Visual Studio and we're going to move to Node.js and we're going to use React. So one of the demos that I have is called the React Power BI Embedding demo. Let's go ahead and open that up. Now, if this style of development, is new for you, what's going to happen, when you download a Node.js style application, you need to have Node.js already installed. If you say NPM Install, that will basically download all the different packages. So as people like me put their source code, up into a GitHub repository, we don't include all the third-party libraries. So that's why you have to run NPM install. Okay, now if I do an NPM run start to run this application, what I have here, is now a completely single page. Everything is client-side code here. There's no server-side code. And, it too is going to be using implicit flow. So now we go ahead, we click sign in inside here. Once the access token comes back, it's going to add some other things inside. Let's go ahead and look at our reports. Okay. Now, if you've never worked with React, it's one of those things that takes a little bit of time to get into, but once you start kind of understanding how React works, it's very addictive. So I have different application components. I have an application component. I have the banner component, the top nav component. And the idea is that, as people, click on different reports to open them, we can open those reports. I've got a toolbar in place here. So if the user wants to take that report and take it into edit mode or go into full screen mode, once again, my application has allowed the user to do that. So with this application, also, we have something where when I use libraries like Adel, they're able to do access token caching on your behalf. So let's say we come back over here. We'll go ahead and remove all that. Let's go ahead and kind of start from scratch here. And, now that we've done that, we'll go ahead and sign in. And so there is application state that's holding a collection of reports, a collection of dashboards, and a collection of data sets. And let's go back over here. And here, first time, I get the dashboards. Notice that there's two calls. The first one gets challenged for authentication, and the second one succeeds. But now that we've done that, let's go ahead and get reports. Let's go ahead and get data sets. And now that we've done that, we're basically caching those things inside there. Okay, there's also some code here, that if I quickly kind of show how the pieces fit together, the application has something where it has different views because we're using the React router. So if I go to the route, which is the reports route, there is the reports view inside here. And the first time we go to the reports view, we have some code that basically is going to call get reports. And it's going to look to see if the reports are in cache. If not, it's then going to load the reports in. There's some extra logic here, so let me go ahead and do a quick refresh. And you're going to see there is kind of a quick loading message, as it's making a call off to get the new reports. So we have a little state property called loading reports, just so we can kind of show that loading icon as things are being loaded inside. And now we have a embedded report component inside here. And the embedded report, is kind of what is doing the work, of, actually embedding the report inside there. There's also a embedded report toolbar component inside there. Okay. Now, kind of getting up to the end of the hour here. But, once again, my main goal today, was to get more samples out there for everyone to use. So let me just finish up by one more time, going here to the GitHub repository, DPE IE, clicking inside there into demos. So today, what did I show? I showed you the daily report personal. I showed you the Power BI Day Spa, and I showed you the very last one, which is the React Power BI embedding. Okay, so I'm just trying to show, lots of different variation into, how you can get at the exact same thing, which is Power BI embedding. And so what are the rules? Knowing, how to use the Power BI JavaScript API, knowing how to call into the Power BI Service API to get back the embedding data that you want. Okay, and then one more second, Chuck, I'll turn over to you. One more plug. If anyone, wants to do a deep dive on Power BI embedding, please check out what we have at criticalpathtraining.com, a 2-day hands-on workshop where we're going to drill down into lots of these different areas. November 28th in Portland is the first 2-day event. And then the second one in sunny Tampa on December 18th, where you can learn Power BI embedding skills just in time for Christmas. Okay.
And if you have more time, I know that you do the Power App sessions that you've been actually doing that training as well. So you have to look at that.
Yes, we have all kinds of wonderful courses here. Exactly right. Well, do you want to take control back?
Yeah, we had one other question. I think that we're only going to have time for one. Stephen was asking, can you show an API to check how many of the embed tokens have you used for development? Unfortunately, Stephen, I don't think there's an API. I believe it's in the audit log. Otherwise, what you'd have to do is you actually use something like application insights or some telemetry monitoring system to keep track of yourself. It would actually be really, really easy to do. I don't know if you've used Log4net, Ted, but if you went out and actually just did a quick log in Log4net and actually rolled that up into New Relic or Application Insights, it would be a trivial way of actually looking at how many of those embed tokens you're using. So easy solution. And I believe it's also in the audit log, but probably not how you want to actually consume it. Other than that, Ted, thank you very, very much for actually offering to do this. And I am looking forward to seeing you in January. And I will see if I can come down and actually visit you in Portland. Maybe I'll bring Sergey with us and we'll make it a developers boys out in the town.
That would be good.
All right. I'll talk to you later. Thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting me, Chuck.
Okay. Bye, guys.